Sandra, you've done some pretty amazing work, and we're really excited to be able to hear your insights on rolling through negotiations. So, welcome.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me, Matthew. Really delighted to be here.
One of the things that you've done is establish the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, right? And you're not an Aboriginal person, but you're passionate to see reconciliation, truth and justice done right. Where does that sort of drive come from when you don't have Aboriginal blood in your veins, but you've got passion to fulfil these sorts of objectives?
Well, Matthew, when I went through schooling system, as most non-Indigenous people did at the time I went through, we learnt nothing about Indigenous issues. We learned about Captain Cook and Phar and Don Bradman. They were the only Australian things we learnt, but nothing about Indigenous issues. And I got to uni and I was studying law, and I wanted to do some art subjects. And my mum, my wise old mum, she's departed us now, but certainly, mothers always know best. And she said to me, I was looking for some art subjects to study, and she said, "Why don't you study Indigenous studies? I think you'd like it." And she was 100% right. So I studied Indigenous studies, really enjoyed it, was challenged by it, was appalled at what I didn't know, was appalled at the lack of the education system and the media in this country to educate people. And I really engaged with it to the extent I dropped out of my law degree. So I know you're a lawyer, sorry about that, but I dropped out of my law degree and just kept studying and ended up being fortunate. I'm one of those sad people, Matthew, who liked university so much as a student I never left. So I've been an academic for 20 odd years, and really very passionate about reconciliation. And but I have a very particular focus on what I see reconciliation is, and I'm really passionate about that. I don't agree with a lot of people's views on reconciliation that see it as a performative approach. I see reconciliation. That's why I named the centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, because I think you can't have justice without truth, and you can't have reconciliation without justice. I think they're really inextricably linked. So many people see reconciliation predominantly non-Indigenous and Indigenous people getting along, and of course we want to make sure people get along better, but that's ignoring a lot of the structural issues that we need to address in this country. So constitutional reform, recognising Indigenous rights, privileging Indigenous knowledges, addressing racism and white privilege, recognising self-determination and treaty, looking at sovereignty. Some of these really key critical things I think do belong in a reconciliation process, but they have to belong in a genuine reconciliation process. And too many non-Indigenous people and non-Indigenous organisations do the performative reconciliation, but not the genuine reconciliation. And when I say performative reconciliation, what I mean is, if you work at an organisation that flies the Aboriginal flag during National Reconciliation Week and has a morning tea during NAIDOC week, not that there's anything wrong with those issues, but if that's all you're doing, then it's very performative. It's just really trying to perform rather than doing something about substantial change. So an organisation, if they're interested in substantive reconciliation, they'd be ensuring that there was Indigenous staff, not just at entry-level positions, but right through the organisation to senior levels, to executives, to be on the board, that they'd have genuine anti-racist policies in the organisation, that they'd have genuine relationships with Indigenous suppliers, Indigenous businesses. So stuff that's actually much more substantive would be. And as an ally, as an individual ally, if you're wearing a lot of trendy T-shirts, again, I have a lot of trendy T-shirts I wear, talk about treaty and truth, and again, there's nothing wrong with that, but if that's all you're doing, then it's performative reconciliation. Allies should be genuinely standing up for Indigenous rights and challenging racism where they see it, challenging white fragility, white privilege. So that's sort of my focus when you ask me about what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about doing what I can to support genuine reconciliation in this country, not continuing what a lot of people do, which is just pushing for performative reconciliation.
Why are you so passionate about reconciliation as a non-Aboriginal person?
I think a lot of it comes down to justice as well. I've been absolutely privileged, Matthew, to be working in higher education with amazing Indigenous leaders for 20, 25 years. And I've learned so much from these incredible leaders. Many of them are household names, many of them are not household names, but they've all taught me a huge amount and inspire me to do what I do. And there's so much injustice that still occurs in this country. We just, what we could see with The referendum was the most beautiful invitation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, to us as non-Indigenous people to walk alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for voice, treaty and truth. It was a beautiful invitation, and the nation squibbed it. The nation overwhelmingly rejected it, which is devastating, and it just makes me more determined to keep fighting and doing what I can in my own limited way to push for reconciliation. And we've seen since the referendum the rise in racism in this country, that I think what I call bad actors. There's a lot of bad actors who are using the result of the referendum, which is about an advisory body, but they're using the result of the referendum to push back against the gains won in reconciliation and in Indigenous rights movement over the last 20, 25 years. So we're seeing these shocking attempts to push back against welcomes to country, against acknowledgement of the country. We have, the former opposition leader of this country refusing to stand in front of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags. I mean, how ridiculous is that? So, that's the pushback against that, I think, is really continue to galvanise me and many, many others in the reconciliation movement to keep doing what we can to challenge those divisive and reactionary attempts by these bad actors against reconciliation following the voice referendum. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I don't want to downplay the incredible support we have got from the broader community, and we've got to remember that 6.2 million Australians did vote for the referendum, and reconciliation is there's a lot of people engaged in reconciliation. So, as you know, I'm co-chair of Reconciliation Victoria. We've got over I think it's close to 40 local reconciliation groups around the state, both in metropolitan and regional Victoria, where I've had the pleasure of going to meet with most of those groups over the last few years. And they're doing really inspiring work, working with traditional owners on local truth-telling and local reconciliation activities. So that's very inspiring to see. So there is a lot of hope. And the other thing, Matthew, that I get a lot of hope from is the incredible inspiring work from First Nations leaders. I mean, I'm very fortunate to live in Victoria, where we've had a First Nations voice in this state for several years through the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is a democratically elected body. So whilst the rest of the country was concerned about what was going to happen with a voice to the federal government, we've had that successfully working in Victoria, very successfully for many years now, and it's worked really well. So we've implemented the voice part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The Europe Justice Commission, which is Australia's first Indigenous-run truth-telling commission, has just wound up after 4 years, and it's had some incredible publications about the true history of this state, and that's some incredible work. So that's the truth part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And very excitingly, that truth through the Europe Justice Commission is informing the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria as they negotiate with the Victorian government to implement a treaty. And so Victoria is going to be the first jurisdiction in this country to ever actually have a treaty with Indigenous peoples. I mean, so as you know, most countries in the world have treaties with First Nations peoples, and many have had them for many, many years, centuries, decades and centuries. But in Australia, we've never had a treaty. But it's really exciting to know that the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria and the Treaty Authority are working very productively with the Victorian government to have a treaty in place by the end of the year. So that's incredibly inspiring for non-Indigenous people who are passionate about reconciliation to see what the incredible work being done by First Nations leaders is happening. But it's not just happening in Victoria. As you know, in your state in South Australia, we have the First Nations voice of the South Australian Parliament. Tasmania has just agreed to look at a process of truth-telling. So there are things that are happening, but I think it's important to note that not only are there divisive and racist individuals out there pushing back against reconciliation, unfortunately and very sadly, there's some very reactionary governments that are doing some shocking work in this space as well. So in Queensland, despite having a commitment that was originally supported by the then opposition to support treaty and truth in Queensland, once that opposition became government late last year, they actually overturned the bill, the legislation, and they reneged on their previous commitment, and they overturned a commitment to do treaty and truth-telling and abolished those bodies that were designed to do that. The Northern Territory has done the same thing, and Tasmania recently has just reneged on their commitment to do treaty. So I'm hoping that Victoria can show the rest of the country the way forward, that the sky's not going to fall in when we get a treaty. In fact, I'm very believing that a treaty will make Victoria a better place to live for everyone, Indigenous Victorians and non-Indigenous Victorians. And I think that's going to be an incredible role model for the rest of the country that hopefully other governments will start to see around the country, that will start to be able to have a treaty in other states as well. We'll have truth telling in other states. And of course, the other thing I think we need to point out is the Albanese government in 2022 Albanese committed during his election victory speech in 2022 to implement the Uluru Statement in full, and he's still not done that. So yes, he tried to have the referendum for the voice component, but he has not to this date implemented a Makarrata Commission to address treaty and truth, and so he really needs to do that. He's certainly got a mandate. So yes, on the one hand, I'm inspired, Matthew, by incredible First Nations leaders and by a lot of really genuine allies, but it's still very heartbreaking to see the political games being played by all parties, some worse than others. And aside from what's happening in Victoria, there's not a lot of really genuine engagement across the Voice, Treaty and Truth and the Uluru Statement from the Heart from anywhere else in the country, which is very disappointing.
Does there need to be more people like you, Andrew, that look beyond the fluffery? Often there's a lot of words that get moved around without the sentiment of meaning with those words. And I say this as an example, reconciliation, a common question on the term reconciliation is, how can we have reconciliation when we never had conciliation to begin with between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people on these lands?
Yeah, and it's important. It's a good point. It's something I've wrestled with myself. I'm not wedded to the word reconciliation, but and it's important to know where the word came from, because in the 1980s, First Nations leaders across the country were campaigning very strongly for a treaty and campaigning for national land rights. And the Hawke government promised both and reneged on both. They promised a treaty and they promised national land rights, and they didn't enact either. And when Bob Hawke promised a treaty at the Barunga Festival in 1988, he promised that would be happening by 1990, and then he backtracked almost immediately. And a few weeks later, he said, paraphrasing his words were, "It's not the word that matters so much as long as there's a sense of reconciliation." And that from that moment on, Matthew, we then started having a reconciliation process that went for 10 years. So I don't mind whether it's called reconciliation or something else, but what I don't want, and I never wanted this, it can't be some gammon reconciliation process that's just not genuine. And we see that in many reconciliation action plans. So, reconciliation action plans are an agreements between organisations and the peak national body Reconciliation Australia to look at ways that organisation can commit to reconciliation. Now, the data shows, Matthew, that if they're done correctly, it can have an impact on attitudinal change in the organisation. So the data shows when you look at surveys done of RAP employees or people who work in RAP organisations and the general wider non-Indigenous community, that the attitudes of non-Indigenous people in RAP organisations are significantly more supportive of Indigenous rights and more supportive of Indigenous peoples and more opposed to racism than exists in the wider community. And that's all good. But the problem with some RAPs is some RAPs are not actually engaging properly in substantive reconciliation. And we could see that, Matthew, during the referendum, because I was really appalled that so many organisations that had RAPs did not support the Voice referendum. And my view is that if you have a RAP, and the whole point about having a RAP is that you want to privilege and promote and advocate for First Nations leadership and First Nations voices. So whether that's staff, whether that's CEO, whether that's board members, whether that's business partners. So if you have a genuine RAP, you want to see First Nations voices in your organisation. Well, if you're going to commit to your own organisation of having a First Nations voice to your organisation, why wouldn't you then commit to having a First Nations voice to Parliament for the whole Australian country? And so I thought there's a lot of hypocrisy in many organisations. So I don't mind RAPs if they're done properly, but a lot of people out there do have genuine concerns that they're a ticker box process, and that can of course then impact on what reconciliation is seen. So I completely support the criticisms that many make of reconciliation, and my argument would be that that's not genuine reconciliation. I think if you do it properly and you address Indigenous rights and all those things I talked about earlier, then you actually are going to have a substantive reconciliation process, and you look at doing genuine reparative justice, not just window dressing.
Yes, because when you speak about this genuineness, it's also the genuineness of the intention. And this is where the difference is found between the words like reconciliation, truth, justice, and the institutional level of the way that these terms get implemented, for example, reconciliation action plans. And so this is where sometimes there can be a loss behind the words. What's most important is that intention. If we see organisations that have the genuine intention of truly wanting to work with Aboriginal businesses, truly wanting to take a stand and make decisions, go in directions that goes towards closing the gap, this is where we're going to see the difference coming from.
Absolutely, and organisations have to be accountable too, Matthew. So organisations, when they get a RAP, will trump it all on social media, and they'll have their glossy pages of beautiful artwork and glossy pages of their RAP, and that's all great. Happy for them to be promoting. But when they finish their RAP, very few organisations and very few actually produce a report at the end of it. And so I would call on any organisation that has a RAP and wants to be genuine about it to have actually a report at the end, like a simple traffic light report. And for every target that they say, it's either listed as green, which means it's been successful, and red, which it hasn't been, and orange, meaning partially completed. And so then people can see the organisations. Some of these are some of Australia's largest companies. I'd love to see in these companies that have really high-level RAPs, have they actually implemented what they've committed to do? So anyone can actually say in a RAP, they're going to do this and do that. And I know that Reconciliation Australia does a really serious attempt to actually make sure that people are accountable. But I think the simplest thing is to have a traffic light report at the end of each RAP cycle, and that's publicly available, so anyone can see, has the organisation genuinely achieved what it said, or is it all just words and fluffery?
Yeah, shifting from the place of being a mere marketing piece to a place of accountability and having proper reporting mechanisms is always a must when we want to have transparency in a process. And if there is genuine intention, it's in everybody's best interest to have this level of transparency. But how do we negotiate, Andrew, with organisations, with corporate leaders, with government decision makers? How can we negotiate with these people to ensure they have the right mindset in place towards what's necessary at this humane level?
It's an interesting question because I get asked a lot by organisations to advise them on their RAPs. I'm happy to have some preliminary conversations with them. But one of the questions I first asked, Matthew, with these organisations when they approach me is, what's your why? Why do you want a reconciliation action plan? And it really continues to shock me how many of them actually don't know the answer to that. Because what they're often doing it for is because they're trying to keep up with their competitors who've got a RAP, or they need a RAP to get procurement contracts with governments. But that's not a genuine reason to have a RAP. So organisations really, at the very start of it, needs to say why they actually want to have a RAP, what's in it for them. And so I think there needs to be that genuine engagement. And then when a RAP's being developed, it needs to ensure that Indigenous staff and Indigenous people in the organisation have a genuine engagement with it. But so also do non-Indigenous people as well. So often in organisations, the RAP might be run by one or two Indigenous staff, and non-Indigenous people don't actually feel like they're part of it. And non-Indigenous people need to be engaged. And that's where I think we shouldn't just focus on RAPs and organisations. We need to look at the accountability of the individual as well. A really good friend of mine, Professor Mark Rose, he often talks about describing himself as like the Black Siri, because people will say, Mark, what about this, and Mark, what about that? So there's always a huge colonial load on Indigenous staff and organisations to be the repository of all wisdom about Indigenous issues. And that went into hyperdrive, Matthew, during the referendum. There's so many Aboriginal staff in organisations, particularly there was only one or two Indigenous staff in an organisation, had to become constitutional lawyers to explain all the intricacies of the referendum. And at my university, I had to send a couple of all-staff emails to say to staff, if you're interested in the referendum, that's great. Come to our website, because we've got lots of internal and external references. But if you have an Aboriginal friend and you see them getting a cup of coffee at the cafeteria, don't waylay them and badger them about what the referendum's all about, because that's not safe for them. So us as non-Indigenous people have to be much more accountable in educating ourselves. And so, one of the things I often say, if you're a non-Indigenous staff member and one of your colleagues says a racist comment, don't turn to your Aboriginal colleague and expect them to address it. You tell that non-Indigenous racist what they're doing is wrong, and you've got to be accountable for standing up against racism yourself. So I'm very much a strong believer in non-Indigenous people educating themselves, standing up against racism, and beyond that, advocating in their own spheres of influences, in their families and their friendship networks, in their sporting clubs, in their churches or religious groups, and finding ways to advocate for genuine reconciliation in that process there. And the other thing I suppose I do want to add is we're talking about individuals and organisations, but really some of the big substantive changes in this country have to come from governments. And so one of the problems with RAPS is it focuses on what individuals or society can do, but it's also governments that need to address things. So constitutional changes and some of the really hard to deal with issues of reparative justice have to be looked at a societal level, at a government level. And that's where I think reconciliation needs to be much improved in this country as well.
And I think that starting with why is a great place to be coming from. When we deliver our BAM Battle Against Blackcladding Masterclass, it's a 2-day program, and the first part of the masterclass is looking at why. Why is engaging with authentic Aboriginal businesses so important? Why is it so important to be able to make these positive changes towards closing the gap? And if we can understand the why, then implementing the how becomes a lot easier. We need to have everybody on the same page with that true, genuine intention to be able to make a difference. And I think this is also a principle of negotiation, no matter the context of negotiations. If we can have people that are coming together with genuine intention, with a true understanding of the why, that's the place to bridge from the problem into solution, I believe, when we balance especially important issues like truth-telling, reconciliation, justice.
Absolutely. And I think non-Indigenous people need to be humble as well. Like, I've been incredibly fortunate and lucky to be doing this work for 20-odd years, but I'm learning stuff all the time. I make mistakes all the time, and I've got to learn from that and be humble and realise things that I need to get better at. I think sometimes some of the worst people that I've had to deal with, Matthew, are not necessarily the out-and-out racists, but it's the people who've done one cultural competency training course for 3 hours, and they think they know all the solutions. So I think Stephen Hawking once said the most dangerous person is someone with a little bit of knowledge but thinks they know a lot. And we certainly encounter, unfortunately, many non-Indigenous people in that category. So I did some research a few years ago at another university where we actually asked non-Indigenous peoples to give us a description of the types of engagements they've had with Indigenous issues at the university. So it could have been a lecture they went to, or it could have been a cultural engagement course, or visiting an Aboriginal community, or doing attending a welcome to country and smoking ceremony. We asked them to explain the types of engagements they'd had, and then we also asked them to self-rate their own level of cultural competency. And what we found very interesting was there was no correlation at all between the type of activity they did and their level of cultural competency. The correlation, though, was very strong between the number of activities they did. So the more activities they did, the more they felt comfortable and confident in their level of cultural understanding. And so that's just a good example that for a lot of organisations, they have a RAP and they expect someone to do a 2-hour training course on day one of their employment and then never do anything again. That's not going to be very helpful. So we need to have non-Indigenous people continuing learning, being humble and recognise they need to improve, and doing a whole range of engagement with Indigenous issues and Indigenous matters. So that's, I think, a really important finding that backs up that need to not just have a once-off training course, but to actually have a genuine engagement.
Absolutely. And I love the genuineness in which you carry in the work that you do. Andrew, we need to see many more allies out there knocking on doors, making noise, but more than that, deeply ingraining the wisdom, the ways of thinking, the sentiment of reconciliation into organisations. So keep doing the amazing work that you are doing, Andrew, and thanks for being part of Rolling Through Negotiations.
Thanks very much. Actually, really, really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and is there anything you would like to share as final words of wisdom before we go?
One thing I haven't talked a bit about is when I established the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice just on 2 years ago, I've been incredibly fortunate to we've recruited some amazing First Nations leaders from across Australia. So Professor Emma J. Gavin, Professor Bindi Bennett, Professor Dennis Foley, Professor Emma Lee, Jessie Flay, are Indigenous academics who are working on country all across Australia and are doing some amazing work in this space. And so we're really privileged to have such extraordinary leaders working with us on a whole range of truth and reconciliation matters. So that's been very exciting. MJ, for example, is Australia's first Indigenous professor of truth telling, so she's doing some great work on truth telling. And Bindi Bennett's doing some exceptional work in a whole range of areas relating to cultural safety and cultural engagement. And Professor Emma Lee's doing some incredible work at looking at building up relationships with governments and looking at treaty issues. So yeah, we're really excited about some of the work we're doing, and to see how the National Centre can move forward in future to engage at a regional, national, international level. So that's an exciting thing to look forward to.
Beautiful, Andrew. It's been great having you here, and I reckon everyone's got a lot out of this particular episode with what you've shared. You've shared amazing stuff, and keep doing what you do. Really appreciate it, brother.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Really honoured to be on. Thank you.
Remember, everyone, to like, share, subscribe, and follow Rolling Through Negotiations so we can keep on bringing you great episodes just like this one. Till next time, us.